Ethan Collins told the world he tried to save his family from the raging fire that destroyed their home, but only he walked away alive. As investigators dug deeper, a chilling truth emerged. The flames that killed his wife and children weren't an accident. It started as a quiet night in the suburbs of Bloomfield, Illinois, a neighborhood where most people felt safe leaving their doors unlocked and kids played freely on the sidewalks. The houses on Maple Street sat in neat rows, with freshly mowed lawns and porch lights that flickered on automatically at dusk. It was the kind of place where tragedy seemed far away, the kind of community where everyone knew each other by name. But in the early hours of a chilly October morning, that sense of peace was violently shattered. At exactly 2:32 a.m., multiple calls came into the local 911 dispatch. Residents reported thick smoke rising from the Collins residence, a modest two-story house at the end of the cul-de-sac. Some said they heard a loud bang, possibly an explosion, while others noticed the sky glowing orange through their bedroom windows. Fire trucks were dispatched within minutes. As they raced through the streets, the black smoke was already visible from several blocks away. By the time the fire engines pulled up, flames had consumed nearly the entire first floor of the Collins home. Firefighters rushed to battle the blaze, smashing windows and kicking down doors in a desperate attempt to get inside. But the heat was overwhelming, and the structure had already begun to collapse in parts. It was clear this was not going to be a simple rescue. Then, out of the chaos, someone emerged, staggering and barely conscious. It was Ethan Collins. He was barefoot, shirtless, and covered in soot. Neighbors later said he looked like a ghost, staring blankly at the flames. EMTs rushed to him, checking for burns or injuries, but physically he seemed mostly unharmed. His words were shaky and barely audible. He said his wife and children were still inside. He claimed he'd tried to get them out, but couldn't. He kept repeating the same line, "I tried, I really tried." Inside the home, once the fire was under control, crews made a devastating discovery. In the upstairs hallway near the children's bedrooms, they found the bodies of Claire Collins, age 34, and her two children, Max, age 8, and Lily, just 5 years old. They had not made it out. News of the fire spread fast. By sunrise, photos of the charred house were already on local news websites. The image of Ethan, covered in ash, collapsed on the lawn, became the symbol of a father who had lost everything in the blink of an eye. To everyone watching, he was a survivor of something unimaginable. No one could have guessed, in that moment, that the real story had only just begun. In the days following the fire, Ethan Collins became a figure of heartbreak across Bloomfield. His face appeared on every local news station, often in slow motion, as clips played of him wiping tears from his face and clutching a framed photo of his family. He spoke softly, often choking up mid-sentence, describing the night of the fire in painful detail. He said he had woken up to the smell of smoke, bolted upright in bed, and run toward the children's rooms, but the flames were already too strong. He claimed he screamed for Claire, tried to fight the heat, and only escaped because he tripped and fell down the stairs before crawling out the front door. It was the kind of tragedy that brought strangers to tears. People in the community were quick to rally behind him. Neighbors left flowers, candles, and handwritten cards on the burned lawn. Someone set up a GoFundMe page titled "Help Ethan Rebuild His Life," and donations poured in rapidly. Within 48 hours, the fundraiser had reached over 5. Grieving parents from nearby towns sent messages of support. Local churches dedicated services to the Collins family. Ethan, despite the crushing weight of grief, made appearances at candlelight vigils, standing quietly near the flickering lights, his eyes red and distant. Social media was flooded with tributes. Photos of Claire, smiling with the kids on a beach vacation the summer before, circulated with captions like "Rest in peace, beautiful family," and "Pray for Ethan." Online, Ethan was portrayed as a devoted husband who had lost everything. People shared stories about seeing him coach Little League games or helping Claire with school events. No one had ever said a bad word about him. To the outside world, He was a man destroyed by unthinkable loss. In private, Ethan stayed with a family friend who offered him a spare room. Reporters camped outside. He gave carefully worded interviews, often breaking down mid-question. When asked what he would do next, he said he didn't know how to move on. He said he still expected to hear his kids' laughter in the morning, or see Claire coming down the stairs with her coffee. To most, he looked like a man who had been swallowed by grief, barely holding on. No one questioned his story. No one doubted his pain. And in those first few days, no one suspected that anything might be wrong. But that would change. And soon, because as investigators quietly began piecing together the facts, the cracks in Ethan's story had already started to form. While the town mourned and Ethan was surrounded by sympathy, fire investigators were quietly at work behind the scenes. Their job was to find out how the fire had started and whether it had been accidental or something more. At first glance, it looked like a typical house fire. Tragic but not unusual. But as they began their inspection of the wreckage, certain things didn't sit right. Fire behaves in predictable ways, and this one hadn't followed the usual patterns. The living room, where the fire was believed to have started, showed multiple points of ignition. That was the first red flag. Fires caused by electrical malfunctions or appliances usually begin in one place and spread outward. But in the Collins home, several areas appeared to have ignited almost at the same time. One investigator described it as too coordinated to be natural. The couch, the curtains and a corner rug were all burned in a way that suggested they had each been set separately. Another detail that stood out was how quickly the fire spread. Neighbors said the entire house was consumed in minutes. While older homes can burn fast, the Collins house had updated insulation and a modern alarm system. It should have taken longer for the fire to reach the upper floors, but it didn't. By the time firefighters arrived, the house was fully engulfed. That level of destruction in such a short time raised serious concerns. As the fire team collected samples from the scene, they also noticed a strange smell. It was faint but distinct, something chemical. It didn't match anything that would normally be found in a house fire caused by cooking accidents or faulty wiring. Suspecting the use of accelerants, they sent debris to a lab for testing. If flammable liquids had been used to spread the fire faster, those traces would show up. Meanwhile, they interviewed Ethan again. This time, not as a grieving husband but as a potential witness. They asked detailed questions about the layout of the home, where he had been sleeping, what he remembered about the night. Ethan repeated the same story he had told the media, but something about it seemed too rehearsed. He didn't make mistakes. He didn't hesitate, and when asked if he had smelled gas or heard anything unusual before the fire, he said no. Investigators took note. To the public, Ethan remained a tragic figure. But for the team looking into the fire, doubt was beginning to take root. They weren't ready to accuse him of anything. Not yet. But the pieces of the puzzle were slowly falling into place, and the picture forming wasn't one of an accident. It was something far darker. As investigators continued their work, they turned their attention to the structure of the house itself. They needed to understand how someone could have entered or exited the home before or during the fire. If Ethan's story was true, that he had woken up to flames and tried to rescue his family, then the fire had to have spread incredibly fast and caught everyone off guard. But if there was another version of the story, the details would be hidden in the physical evidence of the house. One of the most striking observations was the complete lack of forced entry. All windows on the ground floor were locked and unbroken. The front door had no damage, no scratches, no signs of being kicked or pried open. This was important because Ethan had mentioned that he believed someone may have broken in. He had made a vague suggestion during one interview that maybe it was a robbery gone wrong, or some kind of sick attack, but the house told a different story. Investigators focused on the back door. It was intact, unlocked, and strangely clean. While the fire had heavily damaged the rest of the lower floor, the area around the back entrance had far less charring than expected. It looked like the door had been opened not long before the fire began. That in itself wasn't suspicious, But what came next was... The Collins home had a smart security system installed the year before. It included door sensors, motion detectors, and activity logs stored remotely. Most people assume a fire would disable a system like that. But the log had already uploaded data to the cloud before the flames destroyed the control panel. What it revealed was chilling. At 1:47 a.m., the back door opened. There was no motion detected anywhere else in the house at that time, meaning whoever opened it came in or out quietly. 3 minutes later, at 1:50 a.m., the door closed. Then at 1:56 a.m., the fire alarm was triggered. In those 6 minutes, something had happened. Something critical. There were no other entries or exits recorded before or after. No one had broken in. No one had fled. Only one person was known to be awake in the house at that time, Ethan Collins. Investigators didn't have enough to accuse him outright, but the door log made one thing clear. Someone had moved through that back entrance shortly before the fire began. And with no sign of a stranger, suspicion shifted from the unknown to the unthinkable. Could the man the town had mourned with, cried for and pitied, be the one responsible all along? As the investigation deepened, fire analysts returned to the living room, the suspected origin point of the blaze. By now, most of the debris had cooled enough for a thorough forensic inspection. What they found added a disturbing new layer to an already suspicious case. The burn marks left behind didn't look natural. Instead of showing a single sweeping pattern consistent with an accidental fire, they revealed something far more deliberate. Scorch marks formed distinct circular patterns near the base of the furniture, especially along the legs of the couch and around the curtains. These were not the kinds of marks a fire would create as it moved naturally from one object to another. They suggested that a flammable liquid had been applied directly to those areas. Similar marks were found under a coffee table and along the seams of a rug, places unlikely to catch fire so uniformly by chance. In cases of suspected arson, investigators look for what's called pore patterns, trails or puddle-shaped burns that show where an accelerant was used to help spread flames. Here multiple pore patterns were found, spaced several feet apart, all in places that would cause the fire to spread rapidly and engulf the room. The results from the lab tests came back shortly after. They confirmed the presence of a petroleum-based accelerant, commonly found in products like lighter fluid. There was no sign of any malfunctioning electronics in the living room. No candles, no overloaded power strips, no fireplaces. Nothing that would logically explain how the fire started on its own. If this had been a tragic accident, it was becoming harder and harder to see how. Meanwhile, the fire's behavior upstairs didn't make sense either. Fire usually travels upward, heat and smoke rise quickly, but the damage on the second floor was extensive and oddly focused, especially near the hallway outside the bedroom. Investigators began to suspect that the fire had been staged to block escape routes. The way the flames had spread to the staircase suggested it may have been intentionally accelerated to prevent anyone from getting out. Everything pointed to one conclusion. The fire had not only been started deliberately, it had been planned, thought out, executed in a way that maximized destruction and minimized the chance for survival. Someone had known exactly where to light the flames, and when. By now, investigators weren't just looking at what caused the fire, they were asking why. And more importantly, who would benefit from such devastation. With each new finding, the image of Ethan Collins as a grieving husband and father began to blur. What once looked like unbearable tragedy was starting to resemble something far more sinister. The image of Ethan Collins as a grieving husband and father began to blur. What once looked like unbearable tragedy was starting to resemble something far more sinister. While investigators continued collecting physical evidence, they began building a timeline of Ethan Collins' movements before the fire. They looked through security footage from the neighborhood, scanned local surveillance systems, and pulled cell phone data. It was tedious work, but it paid off. Piece by piece, a new version of the night began to take shape. One that Ethan had never mentioned. At 10:14 p.m., just over 4 hours before the fire began, a camera at a gas station on Route 39 captured a familiar car pulling into the parking lot. It was Ethan's. He parked near the side of the building, away from the pumps, and got out wearing a dark hoodie and jeans. The surveillance footage, although grainy, clearly showed him entering the store alone. He didn't buy snacks or drinks. Instead, he walked directly to the back corner of the store, picked up 2 bottles of lighter fluid, a pack of fire starters, and a disposable lighter. He paid in cash and avoided eye contact with the cashier. It was quick, less than 2 minutes, and then he was gone. The timestamp on the footage was clear, 10. That placed him at a gas station 15 minutes from home, hours before the fire, purchasing items that would later be identified in the living room debris. The footage was a turning point. Until then, there had been no direct link between Ethan and the accelerants used in the fire. His story had placed him asleep at home, unaware of any danger, until he supposedly woke up to flames. But the video told a different story. It showed him preparing for something deliberate. Investigators pulled his phone records next. While there were no calls or texts sent around that time, location data confirmed his device had pinged off a cell tower near the gas station at exactly the same moment the video showed him inside. That corroborated the footage. Ethan had been there, and now they had proof. As more questions surfaced, so did a pattern of careful planning. Buying accelerants late at night, using cash to avoid a digital trail, choosing a location out of town, where he thought no one would recognize him. But what he didn't account for were the cameras, the timestamps, and the digital footprint he left behind without even realizing it. The man who once appeared broken and devastated was no longer just a grieving father. The facts were starting to speak louder than the tears, and what they said was chilling. Ethan Collins hadn't been caught in a tragedy. He had set the stage for one. With the discovery of the gas station footage, and the cell phone data to back it up, the focus of the investigation narrowed sharply. What had once been a routine fire inquiry was now a suspected homicide case. Detectives began pulling together every thread of Ethan Collins' life, hoping to understand not only how the fire happened, but why. They started by looking at his financial records. The results were revealing. Ethan was drowning in debt. He had maxed out multiple credit cards, fallen months behind on the mortgage, and had recently defaulted on a personal loan. Just 2 weeks before the fire, the bank had begun foreclosure proceedings on the house. Ethan hadn't told anyone. Not Claire, not his friends. He was trying to manage the crisis quietly, but the numbers didn't lie. He was spiraling. And then there was the life insurance. Less than a year earlier, Ethan had taken out new policies on each family member. The largest was on Claire, $750,000. There were also policies for Max and Lily, each for $250,000. Altogether, the payout totaled $1.25 million. Investigators discovered that just 1 week before the fire, Ethan had called the insurance company to confirm beneficiary details and asked about the timeline for payouts in the event of accidental death. At the time, no one thought much of it. Now it felt like a puzzle piece snapping into place. But there was more. Ethan had recently lost his job at a local construction firm, a detail he had kept quiet from everyone, including his wife. On the outside, he continued pretending he was working normal hours. Inside, the financial pressure must have been mounting to unbearable levels. Friends had started noticing a change in his behavior. He had become withdrawn, distracted. In hindsight, the signs were there, but no one knew how close he was to a breaking point. Investigators also traced Ethan's internet history. In the weeks before the fire, he had searched for topics like fastest house fires, how to start fire without getting caught, and insurance payout house fire, family death. The searches were damning. Combined with the footage, the security logs, and the burn patterns in the house, the case against him was now growing rapidly. What was once a portrait of a heartbroken man had been completely dismantled. The picture now was one of cold calculation and quiet desperation. The fire hadn't been an accident. It hadn't even been a spontaneous act of rage. It was a plan, one that Ethan had set into motion carefully, methodically, and without mercy. And with each new piece of evidence, the truth came closer to the surface. With mounting evidence pointing toward a planned fire, law enforcement decided it was time to move forward with an arrest. Ethan Collins was taken into custody quietly one morning, away from the public eye. The community that had once seen him as a grieving husband and father now faced the shocking reality that he was a suspect in the deaths of his own family. During the arrest, Ethan showed no signs of resistance. His expression was unreadable, calm, almost detached. He didn't cry or plead his innocence. Instead, he remained silent, giving investigators little to work with. He requested a lawyer immediately and said nothing else. This sudden shift from public mourning to quiet defiance startled many who had watched his story unfold on television. In the days that followed, the police built their case carefully, assembling the evidence piece by piece. The security logs showing the back door opening and closing just minutes before the fire were key. The gas station footage of Ethan buying lighter fluid couldn't be disputed. The financial documents painted a clear motive, and the lab results confirming accelerants at the fire scene sealed the suspicion. But there was one more thing that made the case impossible to ignore: the lack of forced entry or any sign of an intruder. All evidence pointed to someone already inside the house, someone who knew the layout, the routines, and how to avoid detection. Prosecutors presented their findings to a grand jury, which quickly returned an indictment on multiple charges: arson and 3 counts of first-degree murder. The community was stunned. The man who had begged for prayers and donations was now accused of setting the fire that killed his wife and children. In court, the prosecution laid out a meticulous timeline. They showed the jury the video of Ethan purchasing accelerants, the security system logs, and the forensic analysis of the burn patterns. Each piece fit together like a puzzle, revealing a calculated act of betrayal. Ethan's defense team argued he was innocent, claiming he was a grieving father overwhelmed by trauma. They suggested someone else could have started the fire. But the evidence was overwhelming. The trial lasted several weeks. Witnesses testified. Experts explained the fire's unusual behavior, and detectives recounted the investigation. The jury deliberated carefully, but returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. Ethan Collins was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. The judge called the crime a heartbreaking betrayal of the most sacred trust, the safety of one's own family. The case left a lasting impact on the community. The image of a broken man shattered, replaced by the chilling truth of a father who had turned against those he vowed to protect. The fire had taken lives, but it also exposed a secret no one had imagined. After the verdict, the community of Bloomfield struggled to process the full weight of what had happened. The house on Maple Street remained empty, a blackened shell and a grim reminder of the tragedy. Neighbors avoided walking too close, and parents told their children to stay away. Local news outlets continued covering the aftermath, but the tone had shifted from sorrow to shock and betrayal. Families who had once offered sympathy and support to Ethan now felt deceived. Many spoke quietly about how they had trusted him, how his public grief had seemed so genuine. Some admitted they wished they had looked more closely at the signs, wondered if things had felt off even before the fire. Rumors began to circulate about arguments between Ethan and Claire, about financial troubles they had kept hidden. The man who was once seen as a victim was now a cautionary tale. For some, the biggest heartbreak was the children, Max and Lily, whose bright futures were stolen in a cruel act. Local schools held memorials, planting trees in their honor and creating scholarships in their names. The community tried to find ways to heal, but the scar left by the fire and its dark truth lingered. The media continued to explore every detail, publishing interviews with investigators, neighbors, and friends. A true crime podcast dedicated an entire season to the case, piecing together the timeline and evidence. Viewers and listeners around the country were drawn to the story's twists and the devastating final revelation. It became a cautionary tale about the dangers hidden behind closed doors. Meanwhile, Ethan Collins remained in prison, his name synonymous with betrayal. His appeals for a retrial were denied, as new evidence kept reinforcing the original conviction. The judge's words during sentencing echoed in headlines for months. A father who destroyed the very people he promised to protect. In the months and years that followed, the case sparked changes in fire investigation protocols. Fire departments began working more closely with law enforcement on suspicious cases. Insurance companies tightened policies around fire claims involving sudden deaths. Awareness grew about the warning signs of family violence and financial desperation. Though Ethan Collins' story ended behind bars, the community of Bloomfield never forgot the tragedy that unfolded on Maple Street. The fire took lives, but the truth it revealed became a lasting warning. Sometimes the greatest danger isn't the flames, it's the person standing closest to you. Years passed after the trial, but the shadows cast by the Collins fire never fully lifted from Bloomfield. The once quiet cul-de-sac remained marked by the tragedy, with the burnt-out house eventually demolished, leaving an empty lot where the family's life had been wiped away in flames. New neighbors came and went, but the story lingered in the town's memory, whispered in hushed conversations and remembered during anniversaries of the fire. The case had sparked not only sorrow but a deep sense of vigilance. Local law enforcement refined their approach to Texas fires, training officers to look beyond surface appearances and dig into digital evidence and behavioral clues. The fire department collaborated closely with forensic experts to identify signs of accelerants and unnatural burn patterns early in investigations. The Collins case became part of training materials nationwide, a grim lesson in how carefully planned arson could masquerade as tragedy. Meanwhile, the community tried to heal. Memorials for Claire, Max and Lily were maintained by local volunteers who believed remembering was a way to honor lives lost to betrayal. The scholarships in the children's names helped support students with financial hardships, a legacy meant to shine light through the darkness. Occasionally, the media revisited the story, interviewing neighbors or experts, updating audiences on legal appeals or changes in fire safety laws. True crime enthusiasts continued to discuss the case, fascinated by the layers of deception and the cold calculation behind the fire. Yet beneath the intrigue was a quiet sadness that no investigation or trial could erase. Ethan Collins spent his days behind prison walls, isolated from the world he had once been a part of. Letters and calls from distant relatives rarely reached him, and the public's outrage ensured his name remained infamous. Over time, his image shifted from that of a broken man to a symbol of betrayal and cold-heartedness. The truth, once hidden beneath ash and smoke, had been uncovered, exposing a terrible secret few could have imagined. The fire had claimed more than just lives. It had destroyed trust, shattered a community's sense of safety, and left a wound that would never fully close. In the end, the story of Ethan Collins and the fire that took his family became a chilling reminder that sometimes the most dangerous flames come not from accidents or nature, but from the darkest corners of the human heart. And while justice was served, the scars of that night remained, a warning for generations to come.